Tsar Ivan IV once ordered a nobleman to be punished, not for treason, but for hesitation. He wanted fear, not blood. Across centuries, other kings followed his path, turning humiliation into a language of power. They ruled through spectacle, rewriting law with shame instead of ink. What happens when dignity becomes a weapon of the crown? If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. In the winter of 1570, the Kremlin was silent, except for the echo of boots on marble. A nobleman stood accused, not of betrayal, but of thinking too slowly when the Tsar spoke. In Ivan's court, hesitation was a sin against order. He didn't need a confession. The punishment itself would prove his truth. Ivan IV, later called the Terrible, was not merely cruel. He was methodical. He ruled a land too vast for his voice to reach. So, he built a system that spoke through fear. He called it the oprichnina, a separate state within his realm, governed by men dressed in black, riding horses marked with severed dog heads and brooms, symbols of sniffing out treason and sweeping it away. Where the law ended, spectacle began. Every sentence was theatre, every punishment a sermon. The condemned stood as living proof that the Tsar's will was not to be understood, only obeyed. Foreigners like Heinrich von Staden, who served within this machinery, recorded the rituals, the processions, the forced confessions, the crowds required to watch. No decree of Moscow was ever complete until it had been performed. Ivan's punishments were not just to end lives, but to brand obedience onto memory. Pain was temporary. Shame was eternal, passed down through stories whispered by survivors. He wanted fear that could outlive him, and he succeeded. Across the world, rulers took notes. From Cairo to Castile, monarchs realized what Ivan had discovered. You can rule through terror, but you can preserve power through humiliation. A sword kills once. Public shame kills forever. By controlling dignity, kings controlled the imagination of their subjects, the fear of being seen, named, remembered. Ivan IV believed he was cleansing Russia, purging it of sin. But every act of purification built a new corruption, a state where loyalty meant silence, and silence became the price of survival. History remembers him as the Terrible. But Ivan's legacy was not madness. It was method. He had discovered that power does not need faith, nor love, nor justice. It only needs an audience. And centuries later, other rulers would perfect his theatre, turning human shame into law and obedience into ritual. Because when a crown can own your dignity, it no longer needs to own your life. At the dawn of the 11th century, Cairo stood as one of the brightest cities in the Islamic world, a crossroads of knowledge, trade, and faith. And at its center ruled a man who believed he was not merely chosen by God, but an extension of him. Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr. Allah was the sixth ruler of the Fatimid dynasty, a man who inherited both empire and divine responsibility. He wanted not just obedience, but purity. And purity, when enforced by law, always becomes terror. His first decrees were simple, almost absurd. He banned certain foods, declaring them corrupting to the soul. He outlawed night markets and music, claiming they distracted believers from piety. Then came the command that defined his reign: No woman was to appear in public again. To make this possible, Al-Hakim ordered all cobblers to stop making women's shoes. It was not just a rule, it was a signal. The ruler could now regulate not only behavior, but existence itself. Contemporary chroniclers like Ibn al-Qalanisi and Makrizi recorded that Cairo fell silent. The vibrant city of trade and poetry turned into a stage of suspicion. Every door, every sound, every step became a potential transgression. Al-Hakim's goal was not protection, it was discipline. He wanted a people so trained in obedience that they would police themselves. When disobedience appeared, the punishment was public, not private. Witnesses were required, the condemned were forced to confess, to stand as living proof of guilt. Punishment became not about correction, but demonstration. He understood what Ivan Volmorth had discovered decades earlier in Moscow. Law is weak until it becomes spectacle. But where Ivan ruled through violence, Al-Hakim ruled through shame. He didn't just break the body, he redefined virtue. This was power hidden under holiness. By merging religion and rule, he gave his commands the weight of revelation. Citizens could not resist him without appearing to resist God. That was the perfection of tyranny, when dissent itself became blasphemy. Al-Hakim's personal patrols at night became legendary. Cloaked in black, he would ride through Cairo, searching for lights still burning after curfew. A single candle in a tavern could mean imprisonment. A voice raised in song could mean disappearance. The randomness was intentional. It made fear continuous. No one knew which act would offend him next, and that uncertainty created the purest form of control: anticipatory obedience. People followed laws that hadn't even been written yet. Historians later described him as mad. But madness implies chaos, and Al-Hakim's terror had structure. He was constructing a new form of state, one that governed morality instead of territory. The empire no longer needed to expand outward, it expanded inward, into the conscience of its citizens. Through endless decrees, he replaced the idea of justice with the idea of purity. Punishment was not retribution. It was purification. When merchants were accused of moral corruption, their goods were burned in front of them. When men were accused of temptation, they were stripped of status, not life. He believed that humiliation cleansed the soul, and in doing so, he turned governance into a ritual of collective repentance. The people of Cairo participated in this theater. They watched the condemned, recited verses, whispered prayers. In condemning others, they proved their own virtue. That was Al-Hakim's genius. He made complicity feel like piety. Fear became devotion. Submission became salvation. By the end of his reign, obedience no longer needed force. The citizens had absorbed his will. Women stayed inside not because of soldiers, but because they believed stepping outside was sin. Merchants avoided forbidden goods, not from fear of death, but from fear of judgment. The ruler had achieved what every tyrant dreams of: control without coercion. Then, suddenly, he disappeared. In 1021, during one of his nightly patrols in the desert hills, Al-Hakim vanished. Some said he was murdered, others that he ascended to heaven. His followers later deified him, proof that total authority can outlive the man who wielded it. He had blurred the boundary between religion and rule so completely that even his absence became doctrine. Al-Hakim's Egypt became the model of a new kind of tyranny, one built not on violence, but on virtue. It taught future rulers that the most efficient form of power is to make people fear themselves. Because when a government defines morality, every citizen becomes both the sinner and the guard. In 15th century France, power no longer came from heaven. It came from bureaucracy. Faith had given way to hierarchy, and the new monarchs ruled not as prophets, but as managers of obedience. Among them, Louis XI stood apart. He called himself the universal spider, a man who spun webs of control rather than armies. His genius was not in battle, but in psychology. He learned how to make obedience permanent by turning humiliation into administration. When Louis took the throne in 1461, France was still bleeding from civil war. Nobles were independent, soldiers loyal to gold, not crown. He couldn't simply kill his enemies. Executions made martyrs. Instead, he built cages. Iron boxes so small that a man could neither stand nor lie down. They were displayed in castles and public squares. The prisoners inside were not forgotten. They were remembered daily as lessons in submission. Louis didn't destroy his enemies. He preserved them as monuments to royal patience. Cardinal Jean de la Balue, once a trusted advisor, was placed in one such cage for 11 years. Every morning, the guards opened the shutters so that townspeople could look in. The punishment wasn't pain, it was exposure. A noble who once held audiences with the king now became an exhibit of disgrace. Louis had learned what Ivan and al-Hakim had already practiced. Humiliation lasts longer than death. But he gave it a French refinement. He turned it into paperwork. Everything Louis did was written down, sealed, and archived. Public humiliation was codified, recorded in administrative language. He transformed cruelty into bureaucracy, the coldest form of permanence. There were no rituals, no sermons, only documents. In France, shame became part of the legal record. Yet, Louis's most creative punishments weren't his cages. They were his marriages. When rebellious nobles were captured, their daughters and widows were forced into unions of calculated dishonor. A duke's daughter could be married to a commoner, even to an executioner. It was not physical destruction, it was social extinction. The bloodlines that once rivaled the crown were dissolved through arranged disgrace. Each wedding was an erasure, written in vows instead of verdicts. Chroniclers noted that Louis supervised these ceremonies himself, ensuring the new couples appeared in court, bowing before those they once ruled. It was politics disguised as sacrament, a union of law and shame. The king proved that loyalty could be produced not by fear, but by disinheritance. When honor itself became the price of survival, obedience was guaranteed. Louis XI called it the Peace of France. But it was a peace built on silence, a state where no one dared speak of humiliation because everyone was bound to it. The nobles submitted, the clergy negotiated, and the people adapted. France was stable because it was ashamed. Observers from Burgundy and the Holy Roman Empire described his court as eerily calm. No public executions, no uprisings, only the quiet hum of compliance. Louis had achieved something even Ivan IV could not, a tyranny that looked like order. His victims were alive, but erased, punished, but invisible. He understood the modern principle of power, that visibility itself can be weaponized. To be seen by the crown was to be owned by it. When he died in 1483, Louis left no empire of conquest, no temples, no monuments. He left an architecture of control, a system where bureaucracy replaced fear, where humiliation became administrative habit. The state no longer needed the spectacle of torture. It only needed the paperwork of shame. In that quiet efficiency lay the future of power, where Ivan ruled through terror and al-Hakim through holiness. Louis ruled through procedure. He institutionalized humiliation so thoroughly that it ceased to look cruel. It looked like governance. Centuries later, his methods would echo in modern institutions. The file, the record, the surveillance form, all descendants of those iron cages. For Louis XI, obedience was not demanded in screams. It was extracted through forms, seals, and silence. He had discovered the most stable form of tyranny, not the one that burns cities, but the one that builds offices. Because when a ruler learns to manage humiliation instead of inflicting it, the cruelty never ends. It simply becomes invisible. Judea, 30 BCE. The desert air was heavy with incense and betrayal. At the center of it stood Herod the Great, Rome's client king, builder of temples, slayer of dynasties. He had marble palaces, loyal legions, and the blessing of Caesar. But power never calmed him. It only made him afraid. Herod's reign was an empire of mirrors, every reflection a threat. He saw treason not in armies, but in glances, whispers, hesitation. Even his own family became suspects. He ruled not from faith in loyalty, but from fear of intimacy. His most famous victim was his wife, Mariamne, a Hasmonean princess whose beauty and lineage made her both queen and danger. Herod adored her, but in a mind built on paranoia, love could not survive without control. When rumors of her unfaithfulness reached him, Herod did not seek truth. He sought theater. He ordered her servants tortured for confessions, and the interrogations, as recorded by the historian Josephus, were designed not just to extract answers, but to destroy dignity. The body became evidence, and humiliation became method. When Mariamne was declared guilty, Herod staged the verdict as public ritual. She stood before the court as accusations about her conduct were read in excruciating detail. It was not enough to condemn her. She had to be made visible in her downfall. This was not justice. It was purification through disgrace. Herod learned what all tyrants eventually discover. Once shame is public, it becomes contagious, and fear spreads faster than rebellion. Herod executed her, then descended into grief so violent that even Rome was unsettled. But his paranoia deepened. He ordered Mariamne's mother killed, then her grandfather, then 3 of his own sons. Each death justified by the same principle, that love could not exist outside obedience. The irony was devastating. Herod built cities, aqueducts, and the great expansion of the Second Temple, symbols of divine order. Yet inside those marble walls, he practiced the politics of degradation. The temple promised purity. The palace manufactured shame. In Judea, religion was not separate from law, and Herod weaponized both. He used ritual as trial, accusation as spectacle, and family as instrument. Where Rome used crucifixion to deter rebellion, Herod used humiliation to destroy memory. To be accused under Herod was to lose not just life, but lineage. His enemies didn't need to be proven guilty. They needed to be made examples. Women connected to conspirators were forced into public scrutiny. their names recited in decrees. Their suffering was transformed into performance, their silence into proof. Herod's paranoia became institutional. Courtiers lived in permanent confession, spies replaced priests, and the palace turned into a temple of suspicion. Josephus wrote that even Herod's meals were trials. Every servant, every gesture, observed for signs of deceit. Power, for him, meant never being surprised. And yet, despite his cruelty, Herod saw himself as a reformer. He brought order to chaos, built roads, lowered taxes, raised monuments. He convinced himself that his brutality was the price of progress. But the truth was simpler. He feared being forgotten. Each punishment, each public humiliation was a desperate assertion of existence. If love could not secure loyalty, then terror would immortalize it. When he died in Jericho, his final orders revealed the logic of his reign. He commanded that hundreds of Judea's leading men be executed at the moment of his death, so that the country would weep, even if not for him. The plan was not carried out, but it revealed the philosophy that united all these kings across centuries. The belief that grief could be forced, that obedience could outlive affection, and that human dignity was expendable in the name of power. Herod's monuments still stand, massive, flawless, enduring. But beneath the stones lies the true foundation of his kingdom. Not faith, not law, but fear of humiliation. And that, more than anything, was his masterpiece. Because when a ruler begins to fear love, he replaces it with control. And when control becomes religion, every heart becomes a battlefield. In the mid-15th century, beyond the Carpathian forests, a new ruler rose who perfected terror into mathematics. His name was Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered by history as Vlad the Impaler. To his people, he was a restorer of order. To his enemies, a myth carved in iron and agony. But behind the legend was a philosophy. Obedience could be negotiated, but humiliation could not. Vlad's country was a fragile frontier, a land trapped between empires. The Ottomans demanded tribute, the Hungarians demanded allegiance, and the boyars, his own nobles, demanded a weak king. Vlad understood that the state could not survive diplomacy alone. It needed theatre. Where Ivan IV had turned loyalty into ritual, Vlad turned terror into logic. Every punishment was a message, every corpse a punctuation mark. He believed the body was the purest form of communication, and the stake, its grammar. Chroniclers from Saxon towns in Transylvania described scenes that bordered on the unreal. Forests of sharpened stakes rising like altars, arranged not randomly but symmetrically. The condemned were placed according to their rank, their crimes, their use as symbols. It was administration through fear, each display carefully curated to be remembered. Vlad called it justice. His enemies called it madness. But even madness, when organized, becomes policy. He punished theft, betrayal, and deceit without distinction, because all acts of disobedience were, to him, one thing: a failure of discipline. German pamphlets printed after his death wrote that he impaled not just enemies, but merchants who cheated, soldiers who fled, and envoys who disrespected him. When Ottoman ambassadors refused to remove their turbans before him, he ordered the turbans nailed to their heads. He claimed it was a lesson in respect. His message was simple: even symbols of faith must bow to political order. But Vlad's most haunting acts were not his mass executions, they were the intimate ones. A nobleman's mistress accused of disloyalty was impaled and displayed at the castle gate, her fate serving as a warning to the elite. He punished moral corruption not with prison but with spectacle. The body became the battlefield where sin and state collided. It was humiliation elevated to statecraft. Vlad learned from the empires around him. From the Ottomans, he borrowed ceremony. From the Hungarians, diplomacy. From his father, betrayal. Yet, what he created was uniquely his, a political system where terror replaced taxation. Foreign travelers like Antonio Bonfini wrote that under Vlad's reign, a golden cup was left at a public fountain, untouched for years. The streets were safe, the markets honest. Not because people were virtuous, but because they were terrified of being made examples. Law, under Vlad, was not a code. It was a mirror reflecting his will. He once dined amid a field of the dead, surrounded by impaled bodies. Claiming it was the safest place to eat, no one would dare approach. That moment, later immortalized in legend, was not madness, it was messaging. Power, for Vlad, was not measured in armies or gold, but in the stillness of his subjects. Silence was his form of taxation. Modern historians often debate whether these stories were exaggerated by his enemies. Perhaps they were, but exaggeration is itself evidence of his success. Vlad understood what few rulers grasped. Fear, when systematized, becomes myth, and myth is a political weapon that outlives the man. Even his brutality served an administrative purpose. By terrifying his people, he built what the documents of the time called a kingdom without thieves. He had discovered that terror, when ritualized, produces order. And yet, his logic carried a darker truth. By turning fear into governance, he eliminated the boundary between protection and punishment. His rule promised safety, but only if the people surrendered every fragment of dignity. Loyalty ceased to be moral. It became anatomical. The body itself was property of the crown. Vlad's death remains uncertain. Some say he was killed in battle, others betrayed by his own men. But his idea survived. That horror, when justified as justice, becomes civilization's most efficient tool. His reign proved a grim equation. When the ruler owns the spectacle, even terror can feel like order. Centuries later, poets would call him a monster, a shadow-feeding myth. Yet, beneath the folklore lies something colder, the first prototype of the modern autocrat. A leader who understood that domination doesn't require faith or consent, only the silence of witnesses. The impaled bodies rotted, but the memory of obedience endured. Because the logic of the stake was never about death, it was about permanence, a warning that the body ends, but humiliation remains. And in that quiet lesson, Vlad III ensured that every ruler after him, from the bureaucrats of France to the clerics of Cairo, would remember one truth: terror fades, but shame governs forever. Delhi, 14th century. The city was a maze of marble mosques and execution squares, ruled by a man whose mind moved faster than his empire could follow. His name was Muhammad bin Tughluq, Sultan of Delhi from 1325 to 1351. A visionary to some, a tyrant to most. He dreamed of perfection, a realm so ordered that even thought would submit to rule. But like all who pursue perfect order, he found only perfect chaos. His cruelty was not impulsive. It was deliberate, systematic, and always performed for an audience. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveller who served at his court, described a ruler obsessed with control, yet addicted to contradiction. One day, the Sultan rewarded poets with gold. The next, he had them beaten for flattery. He built cities, then abandoned them. He introduced new coins, then punished those who used them. He was brilliant enough to design an empire, but paranoid enough to destroy it. In his world, punishment became both logic and language, the public grammar of his authority. The Sultan believed fear was not enough. People must also see justice. Every transgression, real or imagined, became a performance. A provincial governor who rebelled was paraded through the streets of Delhi, stripped of rank and dignity, his garments burned, his title erased before the crowd. The punishment did not stop with the body. It extended to reputation, to memory. The condemned man became a living decree. Disobedience would not simply be punished, it would be rewritten into spectacle. When the Sultan discovered gossip in his court, whispers of corruption, laughter behind curtains, he responded not with investigation, but choreography. Accused courtiers were forced into public reenactments of their alleged sins, spectacles so humiliating that truth no longer mattered. The point was not to find guilt, but to perform it. This was the theatre of power. Shame as stagecraft, obedience as applause. Even his humour carried danger. During audiences, he would test his ministers with sudden questions, and hesitation, a moment of silence too long, could mark a man for punishment. Like Ivan the Terrible, a century later, Muhammad bin Tughluq turned uncertainty into guilt. His intelligence became an instrument of cruelty, and his cruelty a proof of intelligence. To be near him was to perform loyalty with every breath. For crimes against morality, he preferred symbolic punishments. A courtier accused of lust was forced to wear the hide of a donkey, head, tail, and all, and paraded backward through the city, while the crowd jeered and spat. The message was unmistakable. Shame would achieve what death could not. Another official accused of embezzlement was made to watch his own fortune burned, coin by coin, as the Sultan lectured him on divine justice. By destroying both wealth and face, Tughluq turned punishment into purification. But there was a deeper calculation. In the Sultan's mind, every act of humiliation strengthened the state. Public mockery united the crowd, not against the ruler, but against the condemned. Fear became communal, shared, almost sacred. The people laughed, spat, and cheered, unaware that in doing so they rehearsed their own submission. The Sultan had found the perfect political formula: collective complicity disguised as moral order. Ibn Battuta, who admired his intellect but feared his temper, wrote that Delhi under Tughluq was a city of masks. Every man smiled, bowed, obeyed, and trembled. His punishments, the traveller noted, were recited like prayers. It was a state governed not by law, but by performance, where survival required acting the role of obedience so perfectly that even the ruler could not tell if you were sincere. Over time, the Sultan's logic devoured itself. His paranoia grew. The same theatre he built for others began to turn inward. He staged elaborate ceremonies of repentance, forcing his courtiers to confess imaginary sins. then joining them in their humiliation as proof of his divine humility. It was politics as liturgy, repentance as control. He called it moral reform. Historians now call it collapse. By the late 1340s, rebellion spread across his empire. The more he tried to perfect order, the more it disintegrated. Cities deserted, provinces defected, and famine followed his decrees like a shadow. Yet even in failure, his system endured. Future rulers across Asia and Europe would borrow from his script, make punishment visible, make obedience theatrical, and call the spectacle justice. Muhammad bin Tughluq died during a campaign, surrounded by soldiers who once worshipped him, and now feared even his silence. His empire crumbled soon after, but his philosophy survived, a vision where governance was performance, and citizens were both actors and audience in a play without end. His reign proved a bitter truth already whispered through Moscow, Cairo, and Paris. Once power learns to perform, it no longer needs to justify itself. It only needs to be seen. Because in the Sultan's theatre, justice was never about guilt. It was about control. And control, once ritualized, becomes indistinguishable from faith. England, 16th century. A king stood before God, before Parliament, and before history, and declared that love itself was now an instrument of state. His name was Henry VIII, and no ruler of his time understood better that power did not need to kill to humiliate. It only needed to rewrite intimacy into policy. His 6 marriages were not just personal dramas. They were constitutional experiments. Each bride marked a new phase in his war against the limits of the human heart. Henry's reign began like a sermon on divine right, and ended like a courtroom tragedy. He was born believing that kings ruled by the will of God, but as he matured, he began to believe something far more dangerous, that God's will could be amended, annulled, and remarried, much like his wives. When the church refused him permission to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he did not repent. He redefined religion. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 turned the English crown into a theological weapon. From that day, the monarch was not just head of state, but head of conscience. And once the king ruled conscience, every union, every accusation, every whispered rumor of loyalty or betrayal became a matter of law. Anne Boleyn was the first to test the system, and the first to be destroyed by it. She was accused not of rebellion or espionage, but of thoughts, of glances, of conduct unworthy of a queen. Her trial was a spectacle staged to sanctify her downfall. The court sat in silence as explicit testimony was read aloud, transforming gossip into legal scripture. The queen's body became exhibit, her emotions evidence. When the verdict was read, the message was clear. The crime was not adultery, it was independence. By making morality a royal decree, Henry discovered a subtler form of execution, humiliation disguised as justice. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, suffered the same pattern. She was young, vivacious, untrained in fear. Her charm, once a tool of alliance, became a liability. The investigation into her alleged indiscretions was as bureaucratic as it was cruel. Letters were catalogued, witnesses questioned, servants interrogated, every gesture dissected by law. The final report read less like an indictment and more like an anatomy of shame. When she was executed in 1542, Henry did not attend. He didn't need to. The machinery of obedience was already perfected. The women he condemned were no longer individuals. They were chapters in the story of his authority. Henry learned to weaponize marriage itself. For nobles who opposed him, their daughters became bargaining chips in a moral economy of disgrace. The king could humiliate a family more efficiently through a wedding than through the scaffold. Daughters of rebellious dukes were forced into marriages with commoners, aging courtiers, even executioners. Alliances that erased entire bloodlines without shedding a drop of blood. The punishment was not pain, but inheritance, the slow, generational erosion of prestige. England learned to fear not rebellion, but proximity to the crown. Contemporaries like chronicler Edward Hall recorded these spectacles with bureaucratic precision. The royal weddings that began with music and feasts often ended in public silence. Behind the tapestries, courtiers whispered, ambassadors reported, and Europe watched in horror as Henry turned intimacy into surveillance. Each union served as a public policy statement, each annulment as propaganda. The monarchy no longer ruled merely through law or sword, but through narrative, the careful scripting of scandal. Every rumor became a government tool, every humiliation a state asset. By the 1540s, Henry had transformed marriage from sacrament to sanction. His subjects understood that the altar itself had become a courtroom. The rituals of union were now acts of obedience, and love was a privilege granted by royal favor. When nobles disobeyed or defied royal marriages, Henry punished not just the body, but the lineage. He rewrote the genealogy of England to reflect his own authority. The crown could now decide who was legitimate, not only in birth, but in worth. Yet, beneath the legal decrees and theological reforms lay a man terrified of invisibility. His obsession with heirs, with control, with public ceremony was the desperation of a ruler who feared irrelevance more than rebellion. Henry's tyranny was not madness, but insecurity institutionalized. By binding power to intimacy, he created a kingdom where personal desire became public spectacle. It was governance through exposure, a monarchy sustained by gossip, law, and fear. When Henry died in 1547, his court was exhausted, his wives gone, his faith fragmented, but his invention endured. He had taught the state that the most efficient way to dominate a people is not through violence, but through moral administration, through the quiet bureaucratization of shame. His successors would rule, less by divine right than by emotional leverage. What Ivan began with terror, al-Hakim with purity, Louis with humiliation, and Tughluq with theatre, Henry completed with intimacy. He made the private body a matter of public order. Because when a ruler can command who you marry, whom you love, and what you confess, he no longer needs armies. He owns your silence, your lineage, and your name. That was the legacy of Henry's England, a kingdom where even affection was taxed by power, and love itself became evidence of loyalty. Baghdad, 13th century. Once the beating heart of the Islamic world, the city now stood as a fragile echo of its golden age, a place where learning and theology had turned into ritual and surveillance. At its center ruled Caliph al-Mustansir Billah, a man who held no armies of his own, yet commanded something far greater, the authority to define sin. His was not a reign of conquest, but of performance. Every punishment was a sermon, every spectacle a restoration of order through humiliation. He ruled less like a king and more like a stage director of divine justice. The Abbasid Caliphate had long since declined into ceremonial power. Real control rested with the Seljuk sultans, who governed with soldiers and taxes. But Al-Mustansir ruled through fear of God, a resource as infinite as it was invisible. His court chroniclers recorded punishments that blurred the line between theology and theatre, adultery, heresy, or moral corruption. All became opportunities for display. When a merchant was accused of lewd behavior, he was not merely judged, he was exhibited. The condemned would stand in the courtyard of the great mosque, forced to confess his sin before thousands, every word echoing through columns of carved stone. Then came the procession, through the markets, the bridges, the alleys of Baghdad, a slow, deliberate march of disgrace. For Al-Mustansir, the ritual of punishment mattered more than its outcome. A stoning, a flogging, a mutilation. These were not acts of rage, but choreography. The Caliph believed that sin could be burned out of a community if shame was made public enough. The people were not just witnesses, they were participants, repeating verses, reciting prayers, and calling for repentance. In their voices, the Caliph heard affirmation, proof that humiliation could be sanctified when cloaked in piety. The spectacle reached its height in the city square, where criminals accused of moral pollution were forced to declare their guilt aloud before being executed. Chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir wrote that these events drew immense crowds, not for justice, but for curiosity. The punishments became festivals of fear, civic lessons disguised as purification rites. The condemned ceased to be individuals. They became metaphors. A thief symbolized corruption, an adulterer, chaos, a heretic, disobedience. Through them, the Caliph reenacted the eternal struggle between divine order and human weakness. The genius of Al-Mustansir was not invention, but adaptation. He transformed the spiritual infrastructure of Baghdad, its mosques, schools, and markets, into an administrative system of morality. Every imam, every merchant, every citizen was both a potential informant and a moral enforcer. The law no longer governed behavior, it governed reputation. To be seen was to be judged, and judgment became perpetual. In one notorious decree, the Caliph ordered that all who confessed to intimate crimes be paraded through the city before their execution. The details were transcribed by clerks, preserved in ledgers, and read aloud in sermons, so that the sin would live longer than the sinner. It was the bureaucratization of humiliation, the merging of religion and record-keeping. Sin was no longer a private transgression, it was a public document. To modernize, this might seem barbaric, but in Al-Mustansir's world, it was policy. Every civilization that faces decay tries to cleanse itself with ritual. In Baghdad's case, the ritual was shame. When power begins to falter, spectacle fills the void. The Caliph's punishments were meant not only to purify souls, but to remind his subjects that the divine order still had a human face, his. Yet, there was calculation beneath the piety. The Seljuk sultans might command soldiers, but Al-Mustansir commanded guilt. Guilt required no armies, no walls, no gold. It spread by word, by glance, by conscience. And as long as citizens policed each other, the Caliph remained invincible. Baghdad's scholars called it the Age of Moral Clarity. but the clarity was smoke. What truly ruled was the fear of exposure. Witnesses described the city as eerily disciplined. Taverns closed early, laughter grew rare, and even in private gatherings, people spoke softly, glancing toward open windows. The line between sin and suspicion blurred until both became interchangeable. When the state controls virtue, everyone becomes potentially guilty. That was Al-Mustansir's unspoken law. The absence of accusation was itself a privilege. The caliph's reign ended as quietly as it had begun. No assassins, no revolts, only exhaustion. Baghdad's people, weary of virtue, had learned to live in permanent apology. They bowed, recited, obeyed, and waited for the next decree. The Seljuks retained their swords. Al-Mustansir kept their souls. And in the chronicles that survived, the pattern reappears. Every empire that turns morality into administration ends by sanctifying its own cruelty. Because when the sacred becomes procedural, compassion dies first and obedience becomes eternal. Castile, 14th century. The Reconquista was nearly complete. The Moors driven south, the Christian kingdoms rising in splendor and suspicion. Amid the shifting alliances of faith and steel stood Peter I of Castile, a man called the Just by his allies and the Cruel by everyone else. His reign was not defined by conquest or reform, but by vengeance made administrative. Like even the Fourth or Henry VIII, Peter understood that terror could be useful, but humiliation was eternal. It did not need to be remembered by the body, only by the bloodline. He ruled a realm still recovering from civil war, where loyalty was currency and treason the national language. His half-brothers plotted, his nobles schemed, his court whispered. Peter responded not with diplomacy, but with spectacle. Punishment became his foreign policy. He made the execution square a kind of royal theatre, a place where mercy was an illusion and shame the only constant. Chroniclers like Pero López de Ayala recorded with grim fascination how Peter treated rebellion not as crime, but as ritual. When he captured an enemy, he did not kill him outright. First came the parade, chains, jeers, the slow procession through Seville's narrow streets. The condemned were stripped of their armor, their banners, their dignity, and made to walk beneath windows once opened in their honor. Peter's genius was in the sequence: humiliation before execution, confession before absolution, and redistribution before burial. When he seized the estates of rebellious nobles, he gave their wives and daughters to his loyalists as rewards of justice. It was conquest without battle, a rewriting of social order through intimacy. The women of defeated houses became currency, their forced unions erasing centuries of lineage in a single ceremony. For Peter, this was not depravity. It was arithmetic. Each forced marriage dissolved an enemy's legacy while binding a new subject to his crown. His contemporaries called it madness. History calls it efficiency. One chronicled case shocked even his own supporters. After executing a rival nobleman accused of conspiracy, Peter ordered the man's widow to marry the very executioner who had killed her husband. The ceremony was public, supervised by royal guards to ensure obedience. The widow's tears were recorded as proof of sincerity. It was the perfect inversion of justice. Grief turned into compliance, sorrow into spectacle. The crowd watched in silence, understanding what the king had just demonstrated. that in Castile, honor was no longer inherited. It was assigned. This logic infected the kingdom. Nobles began to police each other's loyalty, not to virtue or creed, but to humiliation itself. To disobey the king was to risk not just death, but disgrace that would stain one's descendants. Peter had found the formula of lasting control. When power can make shame hereditary, rebellion dies before it begins. He did not reserve this cruelty for nobles alone. During internal revolts, entire towns were subjected to cleansing. Prisoners were paraded half-naked, branded with symbols of disloyalty, then released, living warnings of royal omniscience. His soldiers joked that in Castile, punishment traveled faster than forgiveness. Yet, Peter believed himself just. He said the cruelty was necessary, that chaos demanded order, and order demanded fear. Every tyrant tells himself that. But Peter's genius was to turn belief into bureaucracy. His scribes kept meticulous records of confiscations, exiles, and forced unions, noting the names of offenders, witnesses, and participants. The ledgers of his reign read like moral inventories: who defied, who repented, who submitted. It was humiliation written into governance. By documenting every act of vengeance, Peter made cruelty reproducible, a model of control that could survive his death. Ayala's chronicles describe a man who oscillated between religious devotion and psychotic fury. He prayed before executions, fasted before battles, and confessed after murders. His piety did not restrain his violence. It rationalized it. Like al-Hakim before him, he saw punishment as purification, each death a penance for the corruption of the realm. But behind the scripture and ceremony was fear, the same paranoia that haunted Ivan, Herod, and Henry. Each sought to control loyalty by controlling shame. Each built a world where the boundary between justice and humiliation disappeared. In 1369, that world turned on him. Betrayed by his half-brother Henry of Trastamara and abandoned by the nobles he had shamed, Peter was captured in his own palace. The chroniclers say that as the brothers faced each other, Peter still refused to beg. He spat, cursed, and mocked his captor until a dagger silenced him. Even in death, he remained a lesson in his own philosophy. The ruler who had made humiliation his kingdom finally drowned in it. But his system did not die. The dynasty that replaced him inherited his methods. They called it law, order, penance. But the logic was his. Courts continued to parade the condemned. Nobles continued to erase rivals through marriage. Public shame remained the preferred instrument of stability. The cruelty had become invisible, absorbed into custom. Centuries later, Spanish historians would debate whether Peter was truly cruel or simply misunderstood, a reformer trapped in a barbaric age. But the question misses the point. Cruelty, in his hands, was not a flaw. It was administration. He transformed vengeance into structure, turning the personal into the political. Because Peter I understood what every tyrant before him had only glimpsed, that power lasts longest when it no longer looks violent. When obedience becomes heritage, when fear becomes etiquette, and when dignity itself becomes taxable, the throne no longer needs soldiers. It only needs memory. Constantinople, 6th century. Marble streets gleamed with gold mosaics. Incense rose from churches built on conquest. And the Empire of Rome, now reborn as Byzantine, claimed to have fused heaven and law. At its center stood Justinian and his empress, Theodora, a pair who believed that salvation could be legislated. They were not content to rule bodies. They wanted to rule consciences. The law, they declared, was the light of God. But under that light, shadows only grew longer. Justinian's ambition was theological, to cleanse the empire of corruption and restore divine order. His Corpus Juris Civilis, the codification of Roman law, was meant to civilize the world. Yet the same book that promised justice also prescribed punishments of moral purification: castration, mutilation, exile, each act rationalized as defense of virtue. For Justinian, sin was a legal category. For Theodora, morality was a weapon. Together they built not a church nor a kingdom, but a bureaucracy of purity. Procopius, their court historian, wrote two histories: the public one of triumph and the secret one of terror. In the secret history, he described a world where sermons disguised interrogations and prisons resembled monasteries. Theodora, once an actress from the demimonde, understood humiliation better than any man alive. She had lived it. And like all who ascend from disgrace, she used shame as her chosen instrument of rule. Procopius claimed she kept a private house of repentance, a convent for fallen women that was less sanctuary than confinement. Whether that story was true hardly mattered. The empire believed it, because it felt plausible. That was the nature of Byzantine power, moral theatre more persuasive than fact. In Constantinople, vice became jurisdiction. The state prosecuted not only crimes, but temptations. Public confession was no longer spiritual, it was administrative. Theodora's laws targeted blasphemy, seduction, heresy, and unchaste speech, turning the intimate life of citizens into a field of surveillance. Priests became inspectors, judges became priests. Every courtyard, every market, every whisper could be interpreted as a moral test. The empire had reinvented itself as a machine of spiritual control. But this machine had its logic. In a civilization that claimed to represent divine order, disobedience was not merely political, it was cosmic. By branding dissent as sin, Justinian transformed rebellion into heresy. To resist the emperor was to resist heaven. And Theodora, who had endured the contempt of men, ensured that humiliation now flowed downward, from throne to citizen, from sermon to street. What Ivan IV achieved through terror, and what al-Hakim enforced through piety, the Byzantines perfected through law. The spectacle here was subtle. There were no mobs, no bonfires, no cages in public squares. Punishment hid behind parchment and marble, its cruelty written in the syntax of decrees. The Codex Justinianus declared that certain unnatural acts be punished by mutilation and public exposure. But to the scribes who copied it, the words were not violence, they were scripture. The empire had reached its highest refinement, cruelty without visible cruelty, humiliation wrapped in theology. Procopius accused the imperial couple of hypocrisy, building Hagia Sophia to the glory of God while turning piety into surveillance. But he misunderstood the perfection of their design. Justinian and Theodora didn't invent hypocrisy, they institutionalized it. By merging divine law and imperial authority, they made contradiction sacred. The citizen no longer knew whether to fear judgment or worship it. Their regime left behind no piles of corpses, no rivers of blood, only documents, edicts, sermons, signatures. Yet, through those instruments, they controlled millions of souls more efficiently than any army could. Every punishment was justified as moral correction, every humiliation as divine medicine. That was the new sophistication of empire, cruelty transfigured into care. Even after their deaths, the system endured. Monasteries absorbed the logic of the palace. Courts cited the laws of Justinian for centuries. Europe's later rulers, Henry VIII, Louis XI, would inherit his formula, mixing theology and bureaucracy into seamless obedience. The emperor's legacy was not the domes of Hagia Sophia, but the mindset that built them, the conviction that purity, once legislated, could sanctify anything, including domination. By the time Constantinople fell 9 centuries later, the empire's monuments were still magnificent, but its spirit had already ossified. Its rulers had purified themselves into extinction. Theodora's convents became ruins. Justinian's code became precedent. Yet, the idea they forged, that virtue can be enforced, that morality can justify power, outlived marble and memory. Their empire did not collapse from invasion alone. It collapsed because no society can survive when its people learn to fear sin more than tyranny. The Byzantines had sought eternal order and found eternal guilt. Because once virtue becomes law, every conscience becomes a battlefield, and no one ever wins. Across the centuries, from Moscow's ice to Cairo's dust, from Castile's stone courtyards to Constantinople's golden domes, one pattern repeats with mathematical precision. Rulers discover that fear can force obedience, but only humiliation can teach it. Pain fades, shame remembers. It carries forward in silence, infecting the imagination long after the tyrant is gone. This is not just a story of cruelty. It is the study of power's most enduring psychology, the conversion of dignity into governance. Every empire begins with a promise. Order, faith, civilization. The words differ, but the mechanism remains. Power, by its nature, needs to be visible, and visibility requires theatre. Ivan IV understood this when he turned punishment into ritual. Louis XI refined it when he replaced gallows with cages. Henry VIII perfected it by weaponizing love. In each case, humiliation became not an accident of cruelty, but the currency of authority. When law loses legitimacy, spectacle replaces justice. When religion loses meaning, ritual replaces mercy. Why humiliation? Because it is the most intimate form of control. To kill a man is to end him. To disgrace him is to rewrite him. The victim's silence becomes propaganda. The ruler's image becomes myth. The people, watching, internalize a new rule of survival. Not, don't rebel, but don't be seen. That is the purest obedience. Not submission of body, but of thought. The medieval chroniclers never called it psychology, but that is what it was. A systematic conditioning of the collective mind. The moral irony runs deep. Each of these kings justified his actions as purification. Ivan claimed to cleanse Russia of sin, al-Hakim to restore divine order, Peter of Castile to avenge justice, Henry VIII to preserve faith, Justinian to protect virtue. But beneath their piety lay the same logic. Terror wrapped in moral language is easier to accept. When cruelty becomes righteousness, resistance becomes heresy. They discovered that the most efficient empire is not one that rules men by force, but one that convinces them that obedience is moral. Philosophers centuries later would call this the internalization of power, when domination no longer needs chains because it lives in conscience. Yet, this phenomenon did not begin with modern psychology. It was perfected in palaces and cathedrals long before Freud or Foucault. The stage was not the clinic, but the courtroom, the scaffold, the wedding hall. Each humiliation was a lesson in hierarchy, each ritual a reminder that identity itself could be revoked. What unites these rulers is not culture or creed, but the same terror of fragility. Absolute power breeds paranoia. The tyrant looks into his subjects' faces and sees potential betrayal in every expression, contempt in every silence. To preserve himself, he must extend his control inward, into the invisible domain of dignity. The body becomes territory, the soul a colony. That is why their cruelty feels almost religious. It is not about destruction, it is about transformation. The theatre of humiliation served another purpose too. It created complicity. Crowds were invited to watch, priests to bless, scribes to record. Each witness became a participant. The citizen who laughed at the condemned, the official who signed the decree, the chronicler who wrote the story, all became fragments of the same mechanism. Tyranny survives not through monsters, but through bystanders who learn to call cruelty law. History shows the same tragic pattern. When dignity is degraded in public, it corrodes in private. Societies built on shame produce obedience, but also silence. A silence so thick it smothers empathy. Under Ivan, fear became heritage. Under al-Hakim, it became faith. Under Henry, it became etiquette. Each believed they were building stability, but what they created was stasis, an empire of frozen hearts. And yet, there is something modern about their methods. In bureaucracies today, in institutions that prize image over truth, humiliation has merely changed form. It no longer wears armor or robes. It hides behind policies, algorithms, performance reviews, and headlines. The same psychological formula persists. Control the narrative of dignity, and you control the population. The medieval tyrant needed a square. The modern one needs a screen. The lesson of these kings is not that power corrupts. It is that power learns. It studies the human need for recognition and turns it against itself. It weaponizes our hunger for belonging. The Tsar, the Caliph, the Emperor, all mastered the same alchemy, turning loyalty into fear and fear into faith. By the time their empires collapsed, their victims' names had vanished. But the structure remained. The law codified the ritual. The church sanctified it. The people accepted it. That is how humiliation becomes civilization. When cruelty finds moral vocabulary, when history forgets its victims, and when obedience masquerades as virtue. Because power, once it learns to speak in the language of dignity, never needs to raise its voice again. In the ruins of every empire, one thing always remains: silence. Not the peace of completion, but the silence of exhaustion. The sound a civilization makes when it finally realizes what it sacrificed to appear righteous. From the Kremlin to Cairo, from the courts of France to the cathedrals of Constantinople, that silence is the same. It is the ledger of bones, the unpaid balance of power. The kings who ruled through humiliation believed they were shaping order out of chaos. They wrote laws, built monuments, invoked gods. They convinced their subjects that cruelty was a form of protection and that shame was a necessary medicine for sin. And for a time it worked. Obedience replaced justice, ritual replaced mercy, and history called it progress. But beneath that order, a quiet corrosion began, the death of dignity, molecule by molecule, until entire nations forgot what it felt like to stand upright. Each ruler thought his violence was unique, a divine exception. Yet, their stories converge into a single arithmetic of rule. Ivan IV used fear to make obedience visible. Al-Hakim used holiness to make control sacred. Louis XI used bureaucracy to make humiliation permanent. Henry VIII used intimacy to make subjugation domestic. Justinian and Theodora used law to make morality procedural. Peter of Castile used vengeance to make loyalty hereditary. Each discovered the same equation, that the human soul, once bent publicly, will police itself forever. But empires built on humiliation always miscalculate one thing: memory. Shame may silence voices for a generation, but it never dies. It lingers in proverbs, in architecture, in the tone of prayer. It mutates into superstition, then into caution, then into cynicism. The people who once bowed to kings teach their children not virtue, but vigilance. That is how tyranny survives without a tyrant, as a reflex, a posture, an inherited hesitation. In Ivan's Russia, peasants learned to obey before understanding. In al-Hakim's Cairo, families locked their own doors before soldiers could knock. In France, under Louis, nobles smiled while signing away their pride. And in England, under Henry, even love became strategic. Centuries later, the rituals changed, but the instinct remained: to measure safety by silence. The technology of shame had become culture. That, perhaps, is the most horrifying legacy of these monarchs. Not their cruelty, but their success. They proved that civilization can grow more sophisticated even as it grows more obedient. That a state can perfect art, architecture, and law while hollowing out the human spirit that sustains them. They showed that it is possible to polish tyranny until it shines like virtue. The chronicles that survive their reigns are careful documents. They speak of justice, faith, loyalty, words chosen to disguise complicity. The clerks who wrote them were not liars, they were survivors. They knew that truth could be fatal, that sometimes the only way to record atrocity is to describe it as necessity. That is why we read of punishments instead of crimes, of purifications instead of desecrations. The language of empire is the language of anesthesia. It numbs even as it records. And yet, history does not stay quiet. Archaeology, art, and rumor recover what law tried to erase. Beneath palaces, we find bones aligned too neatly. In archives, we find decrees that read like confessions. In the margins of ledgers, scribes leave small notations. God forgive us, so it was ordered, done in silence. They may not have rebelled, but they remembered. And remembrance, however faint, is rebellion's seed. The big question that began this story, what happens when dignity becomes a weapon of the crown, now answers itself. When rulers discover that shame governs more efficiently than swords, the state becomes a mirror. Its citizens, watching themselves through the eyes of power, begin to act not out of conviction, but anticipation. They correct their thoughts before they are corrected. They humiliate themselves before authority has to. That is the final victory of tyranny, when the ruler's absence changes nothing. But history offers a counterweight. Every civilization that learned to weaponize dignity eventually collapsed under the weight of its own sanctity. Rome fell. Byzantium broke. Monarchies dissolved. What survived was not their law or theology, but the human impulse to question them. Progress did not come from kings, but from those humiliated by them, from the mocked, the exiled, the silenced, who refused to forget that obedience was not the same as virtue. Today, the stage is digital, the crown invisible, the shame instantaneous. Yet, the mechanism is identical. Power still survives by managing humiliation, by deciding who is exposed and who is erased. The lesson of history is not that we have escaped tyranny, but that we have refined it. What was once enforced by guards is now performed by ourselves. Still, there is hope in recognition. To study these monarchs is not to glorify their cruelty, but to inoculate against it. Because when we trace the lineage of humiliation, we begin to understand that every act of dehumanization, from public shaming to policy, is part of the same architecture. And the first step to dismantling it is remembering who built it. When the ledger closes and the bones still speak, they do not call for vengeance. They call for witness. To look upon the ruins and admit, finally, that the price of obedience was never peace, it was silence. Completed.